If you were to walk up to a random person on the street and ask them what their favorite Pixar movie was, chances are that they'd say it was either Up, WALL-E, or one of the Toy Stories. Now, that's obviously not the case for everyone, but I think it's safe to say that would make up a vast majority of the answers that you'd get. Everybody's talked to death about why these movies are so great, and even more obscure Pixar movies like Ratatouille and Coco are getting talked about and recognized more than ever for their amazing stories. So why is it that you almost never hear anything about Monsters, Inc? I mean, don't get me wrong, the movie still lives on today through meme culture, but you don't typically hear it being talked about for its artistic merits. And I honestly don't get why. Is the story just not as good as we all remember? Was it forgettable? Everybody looks back on this movie fondly, but nobody really talks about why we do so in the first place. So that's why I'm here today. Monsters, Inc. is not a good movie. It's not even a great movie. In terms of filmmaking and comedy, Monsters, Inc. is a straight-up masterpiece. Yeah, that's right. And when I say masterpiece, I actually mean it. No hyperbole. I rewatched this movie like 15 times while making this video, and I genuinely cannot find a single issue with it. Except for these two.
We don't talk about these two.
From its characters to its music, setting, plot, villain, jokes, every angle that you look at this movie from, it just screams perfection. And that's not a word that I throw out lightly. So for that status to have been reached by an animated movie, to me at least, is something worth being talked about. You might not know this about me, but I'm somewhat a big fan of animation. Animation, in my opinion, is the best, most impactful way to make a movie. Film is a visual storytelling medium, and an animated movie gives the filmmakers complete creative control over what your audience sees. It's the perfect relationship. And Monsters, Inc. uses the fact that it's animated to its full advantage. What exactly is it that makes an animation good or bad? Well, there's a lot to it, but for the most part, as long as it stays consistent, looks believable, and is able to convey characters' emotions and personalities to the audience, then you're on the right track at least. With this in mind, you start to get a handle on just why this movie was so memorable in the first place. You take one look at Sully and Mike, and you can already get a sense of their personality just by seeing the way that they interact with one another. One look at Randall's character design, and you immediately know what he's about. You can tell that he's got an ego, that he's sadistic, conniving, mean, and wants to be on top. And that's the beauty of animation. In a live-action film, you would have to host auditions to find somebody who looks like they could represent your character. But in an animated film, you can design them from the ground up to look exactly the way that they need to. So add this to the fact that this story takes place in a world where monsters are the main characters, and therefore it could potentially look like anything, and you can tell that these animators were having a lot of fun. You take one glance at this store owner guy and think, oh yeah, of course he's a shopkeeper. One look at this blob guy and think, yep, he's a janitor. Roz, accountant. Waternoose, boss. Celia, secretary. All you need is a few moments of screen time with each of these characters and you feel like you've just read a character description of them. These character designs don't just fit the bill, they were designed from the ground up to be the bill. And that's only the character animations. But what about the environment?
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
Monsters, Inc. does not have a lot of grand scale to the environments that they create. But what they lack in scale in certain scenes, they more than make up for greatly in creativity and originality. There are so many creative things that they do with the possible settings for the monster universe. The obvious one and highlight of the movie being the door factory, but aside from that, there's also the scare floor, the place where the monsters actually go to work. And again, it is such an amazing and creative concept. There's Mike and Sully's house, which is extremely unique and packed with little pieces of monster-inspired furniture and entertainment. And every little scene is packed with little tidbits that reference the world that our characters live in and make it feel real and believable. Pixar has excelled in creating a world that feels similar to our own, while at the same time feeling original and perfectly designed for these monster characters. Speaking of which...
And it looks like it's gonna be a perfect day to maybe, hey, just lie in bed, sleep in, or simply work out that slab that's hanging over the bed!
Monsters, Inc. is the Emperor's New Groove of Pixar. which is kind of interesting to think about, seeing as they came out only a year apart. But it's true. Both of these movies have an extremely similar feeling behind them. They're both bro movies. They both have a classic guy duo and are remembered mostly for the humor than their emotional scenes and artistic merits. But that's not really the audience's fault when the jokes are just so good.
But I love sports. Dodgeball was the best. Oh yeah, I was the fastest one out there. Of course, I was the ball.
But whereas Emperor's New Groove had absurdist humor, Monsters, Inc. is rooted in sarcastic, memorable one-liners that are littered throughout the entire movie. The obvious comedian of the movie being Mike Wazowski, but other characters like Randall, Roz, and yes, even these two, constantly make this movie a non-stop quotable joyride. But unlike Emperor's New Groove, which I love by the way, I think Monsters, Inc. holds way more emotional weight. Rather than having an obvious message and moral for the audience, Monsters, Inc. prioritizes telling an imaginative, funny story that is made memorable and impactful by emotional scenes, comedy, and characters. By just focusing on making the story engaging and not really taking the time to set up any big themes, it really makes the emotional scenes hit harder, as you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about what's happening and instead just experience it alongside the characters. Sully is not a very complex character, and neither is Mike for that matter. Other than Sully putting others before himself and Mike being a little selfish, there's not a whole lot to dissect with them. Sully is a soft, kind-hearted, talented scarer, and Mike is his short but loud and sarcastic one-liner spewing scare coach. And it's that dynamic that not only makes the dialogue in this movie so memorable, but propels the plot of the movie forward. Every decision we see made by this duo up until the end of this movie is driven by either Sully's kind-hearted nature or Mike's personal biases. But the interesting thing here is that while their outlooks on the situation they find themselves in does create conflict, you can sympathize with both of them and could realistically make an argument for either one of them being right in any situation. In a way, they are both the main character in this story. And that's when it hit me. The reason why their personalities seemed so one-dimensional to me at first is because you're not supposed to see them as individuals in this situation. You're supposed to see them as two sides to the same coin. Even though Sully has a more prominent role in the story and handles most of the emotional impact of the movie, Mike picks up where Sully lacks by filling the role of the intellectual in this situation.
Which means the scare floor will be painted?
Or at least he tries to. But of course, this doesn't mean that Mike is emotionless. The interesting thing about Mike in this movie is that even though he and Sully disagree on pretty much everything regarding Boo, Mike is still always there for Sully. I mean, the man abandoned his girlfriend on her birthday just to help out his friend. You can tell that these two have a lot of history together. Even at the start of this movie, Mike and Sully just have this chemistry between them that no other movie has really ever been able to capture again. You can make arguments for other comedic duos being better from a writing standpoint, I'll give you that. But you can't deny that these two are one of the most unique protagonist duos in not just animation, but film as a whole. A wise man once said that a story is only as compelling as your villain. Now, a lot of people misinterpret this and take it to mean that you have to have a sympathetic villain. And while this movie does have that, the film's main villain isn't sympathetic. And there is nothing wrong with that. Sure, it's preferable, but you don't have to sympathize with your villain. You have to understand your villain and why it is that they're doing what they're doing, which they set up perfectly with Randall.
I am about to revolutionize the scaring industry, and when I do, even the great James P. Sullivan is going to be working for me.
You don't agree with what he's doing, but everything that he does makes sense in the context of his evil plans. He's also a surprisingly dark villain for a Pixar movie. He openly tries to kill our heroes multiple times, gets a kick out of the pain of others, is loud, abusive, rude, and yet through all that, I can't help but love this guy. He's just way too funny and memorable.
Cheating. Right.
So what about the movie's other villain, Mr. Waternoose? Well, he's definitely not as memorable. but he doesn't really need to be since Randall fills that role comfortably. Mr. Waternoose's job is primarily to occupy that sympathetic side of the villain motivation I brought up earlier. You can actually sympathize with what he's trying to do, and you genuinely feel bad for him when he says that he should have never agreed to work with Randall. It's obvious that he's not really a bad guy. He's just desperate and feels that there's no other way to save his family business. Obviously, what he's trying to do is messed up. The audience knows it, and even he knows it. And given all the setup that he had early on as a sort of father figure to Sully, it's actually pretty sad to see that things turned out this way for him. He was also technically Pixar's first twist villain, so hey, good job Pixar. That being said, for a main villain, his design is just straight up creepy. And this walk he does always freaked me out as a kid and left such a huge impact on me. Overall, these villains are just so memorable and are still some of my favorites even to this day.
The hero cannot exist in a vacuum. What our story needs is an ironic, unexpected event that will propel the hero into conflict.
Okay, that'll work. And now we get to the part of this video that I've been dying to talk about. The story. The entire concept of monsters not wanting to scare kids and only doing it out of necessity in order to generate power to run their cities is genuinely one of the most creative ideas for a story ever. And it does a great job of breaking the ice and conveying the concept to its audience in the very first opening scene. So if you're a kid who thought this might be a scary movie in the beginning, then your worries would be put to rest as you see that these monsters are actually more scared of us than we are of them. The movie also sets up early on that they're in the middle of a scare crisis, giving us our villain motivation right from the beginning if you're paying attention to the dialogue. Anyways, hijinks ensues and we get to the heart of the movie, when Sully unknowingly lets a human child into the factory. At first, he and Mike are terrified of her and are only trying to figure out a way to get her back, but Sully actually makes an attempt at getting to know Boo better. He stays by her side until she's comfortable enough to fall asleep, plays around with her, refuses to just send her through this door that Mike kinda picked up on a whim just trying to get her out of their hair. Gives her a name, faints like 12 times when he thinks that Boo dies. It's clear that Sully has grown an attachment to Boo, which only makes this scene all the more heartbreaking. Now that is powerful. It's also interesting to note that this is the first and only time that we see Sully technically doing his job. Sure, you've seen him go to work, but an average viewer up until this point probably would have forgotten that not only is Sully a professional scarer, but he's the best scarer in the company. Up until this point, you've only seen Sully outside of work. Kind, selfless, generous, and even he, along with the audience, is devastated upon seeing this side of himself. And it's at this point that our heroes are then subjected to their lowest point imaginable, and are banished. But there's no time to sit around, because they have to get Boo.
Boo? What about us?
Oh yeah. Pixar knew that Mike had to have a breaking point in this movie, because as much as anybody loves their friend, when put into circumstances like Mike's, they would be reasonably upset. And like I said earlier, in this scene, you could make a good argument for Mike or Sully in this situation. It's just a matter of perspective. Is Mike selfish for not wanting to help his friend and caring about his own well-being? Or is Sully selfish for not considering Mike's feelings by assuming that he'd be on board with everything that he's done by dragging him into this situation? And neither one of them is wrong in feeling the way that they do, and both of them have room to grow as characters. But as much room as they might both have to grow, Sully needs Mike now more than ever, and Mike puts everything on the line to help his friend. Except, oh yeah, Evil Crab Dude. Did I mention this walk is terrifying? Because let me tell you, it's terrifying. But in a shocking twist that I honestly don't know if Sully planned or not, they get Mr. Waternoose to admit in front of everybody all the horrible things that he's done. They book him, and it is oh so satisfying. In probably my personal favorite Pixar movie twist, Roz is actually revealed to be an undercover agent with the CDA, which they didn't need to have happen, but they did, and it makes me so happy. Boo and Sully say their goodbyes in what is such a genuinely real feeling goodbye scene. You really feel for Sully here, but you know that this is the way it has to be. The energy crisis is no more as Monsters Inc. resurges, now relying on the laughter of children instead of their screams, which was set up several times before. And thanks to Mike, Sully gets a reunion with Boo at the very end, which, granted, I don't really think the movie needed, but hey, it doesn't take away from the movie, so it's alright with me. And we are then treated to... I miss Pixar blooper reels. They were all fantastic, but this one in particular always managed to make me laugh.
Go ahead. Go throw up. What?
And as if hearing Mike Wazowski tell a little girl to go throw up wasn't enough, we actually do get to see that company play that Mike was talking about earlier. Again, they didn't have to do this, but they did. And I think it shows just how much the makers of this movie really cared about it and about making their audience laugh. And that's the one thing that I think Pixar wanted their audience to take away from this movie. That laughter is a powerful thing. It's more powerful than fear and has the power to impact the world around you. It's interesting that pretty much every scene that's not an emotional roller coaster in this movie is jam-packed with jokes. Hell, even some of the emotional scenes are still packed with jokes. We start the movie laughing, and we end the movie laughing. And sure, the movie might not have any super complex and dynamic themes, but at the end of the day, I don't really think that it needs any. For what Monsters Inc. is and tries to do, it is simply perfect. Pixar wanted its audience to be subjected to an amazing story, with amazing animation, unforgettable characters, and jokes to keep them happy and coming back for years to come. And I love them for that. So if you take one thing away from this dissection of my favorite Pixar movie, it would be that when you find yourself in dire straits, going through tough times, when you're down on your luck and feeling sad, try to find something to laugh about. And if you can't think of anything to laugh about, I know a movie that can probably get you smiling. Whew, done with that video. Now, let's see what else is on my list. Oh god, do I have to?
Why are you still here?